the standardization of medicine was important so that we could churn out physicians that were as equal as possible across the entire country so that they could provide care that was equal and possible across the country. It standardized it in terms of prerequisitions. It was more science focused. So it became a much more rigorous application process. Now they are having to look for clinical rotations that medical students rotate with other physicians and actually learn during their time in training and not in an apprenticeship style learning model. The evolution of nurse practitioners and physician assistants, where we have now kind of almost taken a couple steps back, where they were originally created as physician extenders and that they were learning on the job, apprenticeship. Medicine,
law, friendship. This is Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik. You're listening to the Medico-Legal Brief.
One doctor, one lawyer, and a whole lot of gray area. Welcome back to the Medico-Legal Brief, everyone. This is Dr. Long here with Lawyer Nik. We've got a topic about how physicians came to be, how physicians training started, and how it has evolved over the centuries. And I'm really excited to kind of go into the nitty-gritty about those changes. Anything to add, Lawyer Nik?
No, I'm excited to get a little bit of the history behind it and looking past the centuries. You can see how there's an evolution of how doctoring came to be. I'm excited to get your opinion and see where this big change happened.
You were able to find how, as the education changed for physicians and standardizations grew and evolved, it also changed the scope of practice, the legalities, the liabilities. I'm excited to hear all about those little details. But bringing us back to when the physician profession started, from my research, it looks like it started around the 18th century. And it was kind of this take everything and kind of throw it into a basket and hope it works out. It was definitely a pseudo apprenticeship style profession at that time. You basically followed a physician or someone that was acting as a physician who had many more years ahead of you and learned as much as you can from that person. Once you felt like you had learned enough, you could then go off and practice on your own. And then that cycle will propagate. However, as we got closer to the 19th century, this is when things started to kind of shift a little bit more, started to have more formal courses, more requirements, and then some prerequisites to get into medical school and training. This is when you start seeing medical schools prop up. And so this is kind of where, very controversial, because at that time, there are a lot of medical schools, about 155 medical schools across the country. And it ranged from city, urban to suburban to rural. And they would admit a lot of different types of candidates without any clear-cut prereqs or classes or courses that were required. There wasn't any sort of testing. Even some places accepted new high school graduates versus 2-year college degrees or 4-year college degrees without any clear courses that they needed to first pursue before getting into school. That obviously would graduate a very different cohort of doctors that would range across the country. Some would be better, some would be not as good. The understanding of medicine would be very different. When this Flexner Report came out in 1910, this is kind of when it reshaped the health system, definitely the medical education system that is more in line with how modern medicine is learned nowadays in the US. And this Flexner Report actually affected not only the US medical system, but it also affected the Canadian, so North American changes in how we educated our physicians.
Obviously, the Flexner Report sounds like one of those paramount reports for the medical industry, for doctors, for medical training and education in school, or even in your ventures being a DO. Do you guys go over the history of where y'all came from, the evolution, looking back years and years and years and century of how you guys essentially became to be? Because I mentioned a few minutes ago, when I'm thinking about the history of a physician, all I have is what I've read in books or what I see in movies, where you're looking at monks or shamans or witches. We talked about in our Halloween episode, witchcraft and voodoo. And then you have clerics and these people that specialize in how to heal. And then sometimes there's holistic approaches. There's the bloodletting and there's the leeches. And then there's the special masks for diseases and people not really understanding the science behind things. Essentially, education got to a point where things were based in science. But prior to that, it seems like it was a little bit of word of mouth, so on and so forth. So did you ever have kind of a history lesson or an education on where you guys actually came from and how the position has evolved?
None at all. That's not part of any sort of formal training. We're already taking so many classes and so many science courses, medical courses, that it's hard to squeeze in even more topics, especially a topic like that, that doesn't necessarily affect our day to day practice. Yes, it's an interesting topic to hear about, to learn where we came from, but it does not affect how we treat patients, how we currently do things. Just understanding that there was a change, a drastic change, specifically around that Flexner report that kind of really turned the entire medical education on its head, because like you said, it was very much rooted in anything but science. There, it was followed science and research. But with the Flexner report, it honestly turned it into a requirement that you followed science, you followed the rules of research, you collected data and based on statistics and numbers and collecting that data so that you can disseminate it equally across the country versus each individual school doing their own curriculum and hoping that they turn out good doctors and appropriate doctors.
So, in your current practice, some of these things get passed down through decades and family and older generations. With the baby, put a little whiskey on their gums. Do these things that may have worked, but not really based in anything factual. Do you still get that in your practice that you have to correct people based on non scientific approaches?
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of medicine because it's always evolving and changing. Even just in the last 5 years with COVID and seeing how the medical field tried to pivot and adjust to this new virus that we were learning about. That's why it's so important that the model that we have is the model that we have, because it is rooted in this trial and error, but also making sure that we collect as much data as possible so that we can come to a result or a final finding that we all agree on or that shows a correlation versus us just anecdotally feeling, oh, this worked for us, so maybe it works for this other person as well. But that absolutely can happen. It happens every day where there are families or patients who've read things online. They come in and they want to try it, or they tried it already and it worked for them. Then they bring it up. That's always a good conversation to have. I never shy away from those conversations. I'm not going to try to deter them from it, but I want to make sure that they are educated on, yes, it may have worked for them, but there is no data to support it as a widely used treatment, whether that's certain vitamins, supplements that they've seen online. Yes, it worked for them, but not necessarily for the broader patient population.
That makes sense. Back to Flexner. You had mentioned that Flexner report came out in the early 1900s. Prior to that, if we look at the 1800s, we look at the 1700s, America is kind of a brand new country. We get our independence. We go into the 1800s. We hit the Industrial Revolution. We have people migrating west. Information is kind of all up in the air. We go through the Civil War. We go through slavery. We go through Reconstruction. So we have all these different things that happen in what feels like such a short amount of time. And information wasn't as readily available as it is today. In that situation, how were doctors learning? Was it apprenticeships? Was it studying? Was it actually going through a formal education? Can you kind of lay the lay of the land for how you became a physician prior to the Flexner report?
Just from my dive into this information, it sounds like there was a requirement of maybe 1 to 2 years of actual medical school. There were no obvious prerequisites, so no courses, science courses that were required or recommended. And there wasn't an age limitation. It was really anyone that wanted to apply was able to potentially get in. The ability to get into medical school was much easier at that time. You didn't need all these qualifications. And then once you were in school, you spent 1 or 2 years going over some sciences. It wasn't like true science that we have now where it was heavily relied on. And then once you did those 1 or 2 years, you would come out and do those apprenticeships where you are literally just following a physician and then hoping that the physician saw enough ailments that you were learning enough from them. If a physician never saw a specific rash, that apprentice would not ever learn much more than what they've seen. That was the difference across all the different areas of the country, because some areas, colder climates, may experience certain rashes that occur there versus climates in the south where it's a little bit warmer, or there are certain insects or bites that cause different ailments in different areas. And so it was very specific. Physician would be very knowledge based on that region versus having a broader knowledge across the nation like we do now. But with the Flexner Report, what this guy named Abraham Flexner was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation to go and review all 155 medical schools at that time and just write a detailed evaluation of each school, their pros and cons, what did they do good, what did they do bad, so that they can come to some sort of understanding on what the educational system was at that time. And he found that 155 schools had vastly different educational systems. After the Flexner Report, about half of those schools actually closed down because they were no longer meeting the standards that were then set forth after that Flexner Report.
What I found too was some of these schools lack laboratories and actual clinical facilities, and some of them were just for profit, where they were just trying to make a buck. As a doctor who had to go through residency, go through medical school, and you had access to labs and clinics to practice in, how crazy is that to you? The fact that these schools weren't actually prepared for these things.
It sounds unbelievable because you're right. They did not have a requirement for anatomy class. You did not have clinical rotations where you were rotating with specialists. Honestly, they didn't have specialists that time. Everyone was pretty much a generalist. And then maybe you might have gotten into a specific niche if you worked enough in it or saw enough of those ailments. But it was a different time. And so they did with what they had at that time.
Yeah, probably before that, a lot of learning on the fly and just trying to make do. With the Flexner Report, from at least a legal perspective, there was a lot of standards that changed that carried over into the law. But it sounds like before that, medical malpractice probably wasn't that big of a thing. Because when you're lacking the standards and you're lacking the cohesion across an industry, then you can kind of do and get away with whatever it is that you think you can do and get away with. It's very hard to kind of pursue the people that are doing wrongdoing, especially when there's not cohesion across all of these physicians, quote unquote physicians, regardless of where they are in their education, their career, doing different things and taking different approaches. And we'll get into the standard here in a little bit. That's going to be very important coming out of this report. The Flexner Report comes out, and now we're looking at med schools. What was your overall thought process behind the changes in the med schools and their approaches?
The overall change was for the better. The standardization of medicine was important so that we could turn out physicians that were as equal as possible across the entire country so that they could provide care that was equal. It standardized it in terms of prerequisitions. It required specific courses that you needed to first obtain. It was more science focused. So this is where the idea of getting a science undergrad degree was important to get into medical school, and then required certain prereqs like exams to test into it. It became a much more rigorous application process to get into medical school. And then it also changed the medical school relationships with hospital systems around them. Now they are having to look for clinical rotations. Now they're requiring that medical students rotate with other physicians and actually learn during their time in training and not in an apprenticeship style learning model. This started to evolve. And then over the years, it evolved into more tests, standardized tests throughout each step of the process, licensing boards, and then bigger and newer organizations grew from that Flexner Report or that change so that they could oversee the exams, the scores, all of that. That's where we have now evolved into where we are now, where it's a huge conglomerate of medical schools, but also a lot of licensing boards, as well as a lot of medical oversight from administration.
I want to ask you a question because I don't understand it. When you're mixing these hospital systems with these schools and these medical schools, it seems like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that some of these hospital systems are named after schools, or the school is actually the hospital system. When I think of like Dallas Fort Worth, UT Southwestern, I see UT and I assume, okay, is that a school affiliation with the University of Texas? Is that a school affiliation with some other school? Why is it UT Southwestern? Is there some kind of connection that exists there with these huge hospital systems that operate as almost a private corporation, and then these educational systems that in some instances are public education systems?
I'm speaking to modern day medical education here when I'm answering your question.
Yeah.
But modern day hospital systems would be the ones to create medical schools or residencies because they have to have those connections to have enough teachers and clinical preceptors to teach those medical students and residents. You will see that the majority, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's close to probably 90-95% of residencies are all associated with actual hospital systems. My family medicine residency was attached and associated and created by the hospital in that region. Whereas medical schools tends to be a 50-50. You can have individual for-profit or nonprofit companies that will create these medical schools to churn out doctors who will then get into residencies from there. I am sure that there are some benefits in creating medical schools, just like colleges get some benefit from the government. There are a lot more medical schools getting opened up these days, a lot more osteopathic schools, and they're opening up in really high needs areas like Idaho, Montana, Oregon. There have been a lot of changes in the last 10 to 15 years.
Hmm. Now, speaking of medical schools, it seems like within the Flexner Report, one of the schools that's repeated as being the staple, maybe the precedent, is Johns Hopkins. Is that similar to what you found as well?
That was the one school that Abraham Flexner felt was a good example of a good standard to follow. They had a good system, even though at that time a smaller school, but they had standardized an education that he felt would churn out a good physician.
And shout out to one of our friends. She graduated from Johns Hopkins. So we know that hospital system is amazing in what they do. So establishing the standard, it sounds like after the Flexner Report came up, all these findings, and then you have a rehaul of the medical education process. At this point, was the DO, I guess, a thing, or was it strictly just an MD?
Oh, yes, DO did exist, but they were on a kind of a parallel path at that time. They had split out in 1874. That's when osteopathy kind of came to fruition. The original creator was A.T. Still, who was an MD physician,
Mhm.
but then felt like there are certain principles that he wanted to pursue, and that's when he created the DO route.
Excellent. And I asked because you are a DO, so that is part of your position, your profession history. Now, your approach as a young adult is different because now you have to consider if I want to be a doctor, if I want to be a physician, how do I take the best educational approach? And now you're starting to look at schools, you're starting to look at rankings. You might even start looking at cost of doing things. As far as admissions, you had said admissions got more strict and the requirements to get into med school also evolved as well. There were more requirements. So as a young adult trying to be a physician or be a doctor, now they have to make different considerations as to how to get there. Do you know of what the requirements were that kind of changed as far as getting into medical school and being successful in your pursuit of being a doctor?
It was more focused on science courses
Mhm.
prior to actually getting in. So whether that was several courses, classes, an associate's or a bachelor's degree, but it was not as strict as it is now. Standards now have only evolved and only become harder.
The other thing I noticed was that there were some negative impacts regarding the Flexner Report. These impacted African Americans, women, minorities, because it kind of limited access to education. Most universities that were serving Black students were shut down outside of Howard and Mihari. I know that there was definitely some pushback in regards to that notion. Uh, what's your view on that? Because obviously, it seems like over the years, minorities have been able to get to a point where they have access to the education. They have access to good schooling, and that's been evolving ever since the early 1900s. I think that's important to recognize. But as far as what you saw, how did that impact the students and the field as a whole?
It was devastating and it kind of disenfranchised several different groups of people. And so those were unfortunately things that happened during that time. And now our community, our society is trying to compensate for that. It still takes quite a bit to make it into the medical field, but I can only imagine that it would be even more difficult as a minority or as a female trying to make it as a physician. We still have a lot of biases these days. There are still a lot of rhetoric out there that is quite hurtful and harmful. And even just in the practice of medicine, there can be some unintentional effects on different groups of people, which is unfortunate.
Question for you, and this might be kind of a controversial question. We are both very aware of the world. We don't shy against controversy. When we have selected schools or looked at other educational programs, there is a notion of, okay, that school leans one way politically, religiously, even as far as race goes. And so depending on your opinion of it, you might say that school kind of only caters to white people. I'm not about that. I don't want to go to that university. I will be the one minority, and that's not something I want to do. And in some instances, you feel like the school or this education system encourages that for that university. Was there anything in medical, and you don't have to name any schools, but were there any schools that had similar reputations in the sense of that school may have a little bit of bias based on religion, sex, creed, race?
I wouldn't say intentional, but there are obviously schools that you mentioned. Howard is still alive and thriving, so they are doing really well in terms of medical school. And typically, a very big cohort of their graduating class is going to be African Americans, Black Americans. I actually have a friend that went there, and she unfortunately was not able to complete due to some medical issues. But she thrived and she loved it, and she found her place there. Yes, there are areas in the country. It's just based on the area that the school is built in. If you're going to be going to more of a rural suburban area, you more likely are going to expect bigger Caucasian class. Whereas if you're going to go into more of a urban area, you're going to expect that maybe there's going to be a little bit more diversity. If you're in the middle of New York going to NYU for medical school, or you're going to Chicago, you're going to expect that maybe there's a more balanced distribution of Asians, Indians, African Americans, and Hispanics versus Caucasians.
Another aspect of the Flexner Report, and I'm going to start pulling in some of the legal themes that I've seen. The first big one is obviously accreditation and licensing and regulation of doctors. And we talked about at the beginning of the podcast kind of the lay of the land, and sort of like, it's the wild, wild west. Every physician's able to kind of do what they want to do, learn how they want to learn, operate how they want to operate. And now Flexner comes out, and there's this whole new evolution of how we're going to approach licensing, the standard of care that is going to set the standard for how y'all operate. As far as licensing and regulation, it created medical licensing requirements. Over 100 years later, licensing requirements are still paramount to practicing. What was your opinion on that notion? And do you think it's for the better, for the worse?
For the patient, it's much better. Obviously, it creates those safety standards, and it gives those boundaries and rules and regulations so that physicians know where they shouldn't go and how far they can continue pursuing a certain treatment plan. In terms of the physician perspective, obviously that has restricted and become more concerning for liability. We are constantly worried about getting sued, especially in a country where getting sued, being sued is talked about quite a bit, and we're a very sue-happy country. That's always a concern, and therefore the medicine has grown and evolved being cultivated in that sort of scenario. A lot of physicians will do what we call CYA medicine, where you cover your own ass, and so you're doing extra tests, extra labs, extra imaging just in case, or you're getting a second opinion just in case. There's a lot of surgeons out there who will request a pre-op for a patient that's 22 years old and maybe is not on any medications at all, but they want to make sure they spread out the liability and send it over to the family physician, be like, hey, can you just clear this person for surgery, even though they're completely healthy? Because if anything were to go wrong with that patient's surgery, they can then point back to it and say, hey, not only did the surgeon say it was okay, but the family physician also said that they were okay to go through the surgery. So there's a lot of that going on, and it unfortunately causes a lot of stress on the physician and a lot of anxiety, honestly, to take care of some patients.
From a legal perspective, when we're looking at having an expert in court or medical malpractice, one of the biggest points of whether or not that doctor was doing his or her job is, would a reasonably trained physician do this in this circumstance? What is it's the standard of care? You see that all throughout the law. What is the reasonable standard of care? Would a reasonable person in a similar situation do the same thing? And so now you guys are held to a standard. Prior to that, it doesn't seem like you guys had that many standards. It was just, hey, let's do what we're going to do. But we've talked about this in other podcasts where sometimes you want to experiment. You want to try different things. You want to do right by your patient, and intent matters, but it's scary. It's scary to be sued. It's scary, especially when the United States is very sue happy. You can file a lawsuit for anything. You don't even have to go grab a lawyer to file a lawsuit. You can just pull up docs online, go to the court, and file something and start the proceedings. From a physician standpoint, the checks and balances help, but it also creates more risk adverse approaches to practicing medicine.
Right, right. And the standardization is what we had hoped originally. The patient would find trust in the system and trust that the doctor that they are seeing is getting the best type of education that they could possibly get in the region that they are currently learning and living. That was the idea behind the changes that occurred from the Flexner, and it has only evolved since then. But it's kind of interesting because we had spoken about this similar topic in another episode where we kind of talked about the evolution of nurse practitioners and physician assistants, where we have now kind of almost taken a couple steps back, where they were originally created as physician extenders and that they were learning on the job, apprenticeship. So, similarly to how physicians originally were created, that's how we were learning and taught. And yet now here we are again in modern day having some providers that are getting that similar education. It's really important that we have these discussions not only between a lawyer and a physician, but among patient and physician, patient to patient, and just make sure that everyone is educated on those differences moving forward. But our audience, if you're interested to hear that conversation, please jump back to the last couple of episodes where we go into more detail about those educational differences.
And to that point, it's like once an accreditation or a body like the American Medical Association or something like that is created and they find success, when you start evolving or growing additional practices, additional bodies try to mimic what's going on for the reputation for the accreditation. So just like with NPs and PAs and even legal field where we have the state bar, you have these dynamics that start establishing the rules to play under. I have a good analogy. In one of our negotiation competitions last year, the students had to argue about pickleball. And you, out of all people, know about pickleball. Well, very recently has there started becoming standards for playing pickleball. There are these designated rules that a pickleball association has determined this is how you're going to play the game. But prior to that, nobody really cared about pickleball until it became the craze. And then all of a sudden, because this is becoming so popular and so many people are starting to play it, we need to actually decide on what the rules actually are and what rules we're going to play under. So then we can be taken more seriously and we can make this a professional sport and then start either being in the Olympics or starting getting TV deals and so on and so forth. So the more important a role, the more education, the more certifications, the more backing, the more requirements and legal bodies such as these associations will come out of the woodwork to kind of establish those standards and exist in that fashion.
So then as a patient, since you don't really have any foot in medicine, do you appreciate the Flexner report allowed in terms of the change in medical education, or do you feel like you have preferred maybe a looser standard so that physicians have a little bit more wiggle room in terms of when you approach a medical clinic? Would you want physicians to be stringent in their education as we are now, or do you want some of the reins to be loosened up?
I am going to take my lawyer hat off right here. I'm going to just strictly as a patient. I decide a lot of things based on the research that I do, based on the pros and cons, based on reviews, based on general feel, and whether or not the person across me is spitting bullshit. Accreditation is very important. You having a license to do something is extremely important to me because by hiring somebody who is not licensed, I'm trusting that they have the education or the apprenticeship or something to do what they're about to do. But there's nothing that says this person is qualified to do this. A license is a peace of mind. But as far as going through the education system, I don't necessarily believe that someone's education is the end all be all. Those things are very important. I went to top 22 law school. There are some law students that were at that law school at the time I was there that I would not trust to handle my case. There are some law students at that law school that I would trust to handle my death penalty case. So there's differences, just like we've mentioned before, good and bad lawyers, good and bad doctors. It's kind of a totality of the circumstances. I'm just appreciative that I'm given access within reason. There's obviously insurance restrictions and regional and geographic restrictions and money restrictions, but at least some bit of access to decide. If I go see you and I don't like you, I'll go see somebody else. So I like that. But as far as the accreditation and licensing, I will lean into that it's when I'm seeing too many letters at the end of the name and all these accolades that some of those things kind of start going out the window, where it's almost like, okay, can you just do the thing I need you to do? Accolades are great, but I need to make sure that I trust you, that I vibe with you, that you're going to do right by me, and that you actually care about who I am as your patient, and I'm not just somebody else in your book of patients.
Well, what an interesting conversation about the Flexner Report, which is the foundation of modern medicine and how physicians train. It was great to talk to Lawyer Nik, obviously, and I'm Dr. Wynn. But thank you, our audience, for following us. Please make sure you subscribe and like. We are also on other social medias. But this episode out on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Central Time. Appreciate you joining us.
Yes, we're doctors. Yes, we're lawyers. No, this podcast is not medical or legal advice. Do not take anything we say as a reason to perform your own heart surgery, represent yourself in court, or diagnose your neighbor's rash. This is for entertainment only. Think of it like hanging out with your smartest, wittiest friends, not a substitute for an actual appointment. If you act on anything we say without talking to your own professional, that's on you. Seriously, don't do that.